You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Support for Images of the Past is provided by SDN Communications and Dwayne and Phyllis Sander. Images of the Past photo, film, and video contributors include Deadwood History, the 1881 Courthouse Museum in Custer, Rick Mills and the South Dakota Railroad Museum in Hill City, South Dakota State Archives in Pierre, Historical Footprints in Lead, and photographer Paul Horstad.
The Keystone Y is the intersection of two four-lane U.S. highways in the Black Hills. An iconic timber-framed bridge now quickly directs traffic to and from Mount Rushmore and other attractions. But in the 1950s and early 60s, the Keystone Y was a bottleneck, crowded and unsafe. The proposed solution was a bridge unlike any other in the country at the time. A film produced by the South Dakota Department of Transportation and preserved by the South Dakota State Archives documented the project from start to finish.
There was a definite need for increased lanes and for a smooth interchange of patterns. Design engineers in the South Dakota Highway Department felt the interchange structure should be in keeping with the aesthetic values indigenous to the region and began working on plans.
Clyde Junt on the right was the chief design engineer. Ken Wilson on the left was assistant bridge engineer. Their job was to design a three-level bridge constructed mainly of wood and make it look good.
There was a promoter, Carl Reese was his name, for the timber industry, I think, or he had some connection with it. And anyway, he talked our commission, or whoever he needed to talk, into putting a piece of furniture out there at the Keystone Y. That's the way he put it. And so that's pretty well how it came about.
We knew you had to design a tri-level of some kind, and that something that would be perhaps unique and fitting in the environment you had out there.
Well, just like any other design, we just started designing.
Never had done an arch, and actually had done very little in wood, to be honest with you. So it was a little scary.
Also, during the early planning stages, Highway Department bridge design engineers Wilson and Junt had traveled to Portland, Oregon, to study the feasibility of the proposed laminated wood arches.
And they were very nice hosts, and they showed us their plant and how they do things and this type of thing, and gave us some pointers as to what we can do and can't do in this larger construction with wood.
On location at the Keystone Y, construction was proceeding full pace. A massive clearing project was required to open space for 7 highway grades and their supporting drainage features. Property owners who had sold right-of-ways through which the road would go were allowed to remove and sell their own timber. Those who did not do so by the contract deadline relinquished their timber rights to the Highway Department contractors. Meanwhile, the heavy earth-moving machinery had moved in and was transforming the roadway to the bridge site. It was an extremely rocky and densely wooded area, and much of the early work was spent on clearing the roots and blasting and hauling the rock outcroppings. On the larger fragments, Prima cord connected the many blasting holes required to break up the massive rocks.
The timber arches were shipped from Oregon to California for finish work. They came to South Dakota by rail and were loaded onto trucks.
There was a difference, however, in the flatness of the road bed, and an unfortunate accident occurred. On a slanting curve of the road, the first truck was overturned by the weight of the arches. The second truck was immediately reloaded so that the weight would exert less lateral leverage on the slanting curves. No one was injured, but the 3 arch sections which fell with the first truck were rejected by the highway engineers, and 3 completely new arches had to be constructed.
The highway director had a meeting, had us down there, had the contractor. They were going to talk about how we were going to pay for this, and that these can be salvaged. And the director asked us if they could be used, and we said no. And he said, well, then they're rejected, and we'll see you in court. You know, now, there aren't very many directors or people that got that kind of guts. This guy I really admired him.
The rejected timber arches were removed and now stand adjacent to Highway 16 on the site of a closed tourist attraction. New timbers were delivered, work continued, and the Keystone Y was dedicated in 1968. Engineers Clyde Junt and K.C. Miller both attended the dedication. They continued to work together on projects around the state for many years.
This one, I guess, is the one that I really remember the most, and try to brag about it a little bit whenever.
Casey and I were the lead structure engineers, but probably 20 or 30 of the guys in our office did parts, worked on this thing. The foundations people, the roadway design people, the field people, there were hundreds of people that had a part of this.
Their efforts and the efforts of thousands of others over the years have made roads in the Black Hills and elsewhere in South Dakota generally good. Good roads come about by a mutual agreement among people, a social compact, the idea that moving people and freight from one place to another quickly and safely is a priority. Roads aid mobility, but they can also promote stability, letting people live in a particular way in a particular place. Places that would otherwise be remote or even inaccessible are made habitable by roads. That is true of the Black Hills, one of the more recently settled areas of the American West. By trail, rail, and road, people have been drawn here for many reasons, and they have been coming here for a very long time.
The Black Hills have been incredibly important to human beings in this area for at least 11,000 years, archaeologists tell us. So it was very important in terms of abundance of wildlife. The flora and fauna is diverse and plentiful. Native people, in the historical period anyways, we know that the Lakotas, for instance, would periodically, annually go to the Black Hills to cut the lodgepole pines. They're so tall and straight, and they were perfect for use for their teepees.
The trails they blazed by necessity were also paths that tied together particular places of spiritual significance.
Certain Native people liken the Black Hills as a whole to the body of a buffalo. It symbolizes the body of the buffalo. So Wind Cave is seen as the womb of the buffalo. Buffalo Gap is seen as the birth canal. Hot Springs is the milk, and other areas like Bear Butte and other outlying sites are seen as kind of the outline of the body or the head, et cetera, and so forth. So, yeah, definitely there were well-trodden paths that were, going from one site to the other.
The rhythm of life in place for millennia began to change in 1743. Francis and Louis Joseph Verendre, French-Canadian explorers hoping to expand the fur trade, passed through present-day South Dakota on their way to the Rocky Mountains. They used native guides and a rough map showing landscape features known to exist in a general direction. They may have seen the Black Hills, but scholars say it's unlikely they entered. Maps used by the Lewis and Clark expedition a half-century later include references to the Badlands and Black Hills, but Lewis and Clark passed by. Twice. The first documented visit to the Black Hills by white men came in 1823, when a party led by Jedediah Smith traveled through the southern end of the hills on their way to the Rockies.
Where the fur trader and fur trapper went, civilization would follow.
The period between 1823 and 1856 was a time of increasing exploration and trade in the northern Great Plains and in the Missouri River Basin. The Missouri River was the main highway.
They said probably at the highest point, there were probably 600-700 actual trappers scattered out among the rivers of the West.
The 1840s and 1850s were a time of increasing violence. In 1854, Sioux warriors killed 31 members of a military detachment at Fort Laramie. A year later, an expedition led by General William S. Harney was sent up from Nebraska to extract retribution. He did so with bloody vigor, marching his troops through western Dakota to Fort Pierre. By necessity, the troops occasionally made trail improvements.
Harney built several crossings, some of them steeper, deeper creeks, and I'm sure they probably used rocks for the most part as their crossings, so that the wagons didn't sink to the axles. And so, yes, in the sense of the most used trails, the military had a lot to do with them.
The violence continued into the 1860s, even as Dakota was established as a territory. In 1868, the U.S. government promised a great reservation that included western Dakota and the Black Hills. 4 years later, for reasons still questioned today, the Army dispatched Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer to the Black Hills.
Custer's Black Hills expedition of 1874 came from Fort Lincoln, some 350 miles from here up in present-day North Dakota, and it took them about 3 weeks to cross the plains to get to the Black Hills, guided by Indian scouts. They found their way down here and arrived on the northwest sort of corner of the Black Hills, I think of July 20th. And then they were entering the Black Hills proper, in some cases following Indian trails, other cases blazing their own trail through the forests, cutting trees down, leveling areas where the wagons, would have trouble going, building a road almost everywhere they went, but eventually reaching the area where the town of Custer is today on July 30th. And they spent about a week in that area where gold was discovered and a lot of other things. A lot of pictures were taken by the expedition photographer. William Henry Illingworth was the expedition's photographer. I've studied these historic photos around the Black Hills where maybe there's a shot of a stagecoach or a wagon train coming up the valley, and it's certainly the case that you can stand in those places today and see, okay, right where the stage was, now there's a 4-lane highway.
Horatio Ross, a miner traveling with Custer, is credited with the first gold discovery in French Creek on August 1st, 1874. 2 weeks later, Custer dispatched a messenger to Fort Laramie, and news of the gold in the hills was out. Custer returned to Bismarck at the end of August 1874. The first group of prospectors to reach the hills arrived before the end of the year.
The first major movement toward the Black Hills was the Gordon Party out of Sioux City and Yankton, and they came across the lower part of what is now the Nebraska-South Dakota border to the area of Custer and built a fortification in Custer. It's still there, a replica is still there. It's called the Gordon Stockade, and it was built to protect themselves from any hostiles that might be in the territory. And then the Army came and kicked them out, and they were all sent down to Laramie and eventually sneaked back into the Black Hills because the lure of gold was just too much to resist.
Others joined them. In 1875, the Custer Gold Camp became the first organized town in the Black Hills.
And at one time, before 1875 and 1876 were over, Custer had a population of almost 10,000 people. Today, it's 2,200, so it's a significant difference. Once gold was discovered in the Deadwood area, everybody pulled out and moved up there. So there was a lot of movement in and around the Black Hills at that time, before people even thought too much about building roads or building railroads or whatever it was. They were blazing their own trails and using probably the shortest route possible to get from one point to another.
By 1876, Deadwood Gulch was filling with miners and those who supplied them. More and more people came by stagecoach. Passages from a diary written by passenger Anna Gerard describe a difficult and perilous way to travel.
I had grown very sick. My strength was exhausted. And sick, weak, and sleepy, without being able to obtain the rest I longed for, I cared for nothing or nobody. and was conscious of but one desire, that they would open the door and let me out, have me on the ground. I didn't care whether I lived or died. It was so miserable. We gained the top of a hill where it was comparatively level for a little distance, and then descended an almost perpendicular road, reaching a stony creek, which we followed for a long time. We were jolted up and down till I really thought there would be nothing left of us but the pieces. We passed a little town called Pennington, and another I have forgotten, and finally reached Deadwood. So ends our journey to the hills, and at present I don't think I could be induced to take another.
The railroads were getting closer. They reached Medora, North Dakota, Sidney, Nebraska, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. But when the railroad approached Fort Pierre in 1880, it stopped at Pierre on the east side of the Missouri. Fort Pierre is on the west side. In terms of traffic, it barely mattered. People and freight were barged across the river, and the wagons kept rolling. The Fort Pierre to Deadwood Trail was the shortest of them all.
When you said Fort Pierre, you could be on either end of the continent, and they knew where you were talking about. They knew, anybody in that kind of business knew where Fort Pierre was. And so it was like a magnet for every new adventure. And of course, it was only 190 miles to the Black Hills.
190 miles at approximately 15 miles a day. It took freighters a month to make the trip to Deadwood and back. Before long, stage and freight trails passed through every improbable corner of the hills. Each dotted line on this map represents a trail. That the major railroads would reach the Black Hills was just a matter of time, but Black Hills mining interests couldn't wait. The first railroad in the Black Hills was a narrow-gauge railway built in 1879 to haul ore and supplies locally for the Homestake Mining Company. A 5-ton locomotive dubbed the J.B. Hagen was purchased. It would haul ore in and around Lead on a 22-inch narrow-gauge track.
Of course, if there's no railroads into the area, well, how's the way it's going to get here? The bull train. So they freighted it across from Bismarck to Deadwood and into Lead in the summer of 1879. A daunting task when you're freighting anything or going cross-country. Think about hauling a multi-ton locomotive across. Of course, it was disassembled. But once they got to the new trackage that they built for it in Lead, it was a sensation of the hills.
There was simply too much opportunity in the Black Hills for the major railroads to ignore. The first standard gauge railroad reached the Black Hills in 1885, a trunk line running through Nebraska to Buffalo Gap and then Rapid City. It would take another 5 years for the railroads to actually get into the hills.
The first one that came into the hills was the Fremont Elkhorn and Missouri Valley Railroad, which built up the eastern slope of the hills through Rapid City and up to Whitewood, and then in on to Deadwood in 1890. The one that came right up the spine of the hills in 1889 and 1890 was the Grand Island and Wyoming Central. It was a predecessor of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. They're the ones that really got involved with the Homestake and eventually took over those operations for the narrow gauges. It was an amazing grouping of trackage in the northern hills. It was just like if you look at a bowl of spaghetti or something, and the tracks were just going in every direction.
A photograph taken in Lead in the 1890s captures both the ingenuity and the energy of Black Hills railroads in their prime.
The top level was the mining line that went from mill to mine. Then the center level was the Elkhorn, later the Chicago Northwestern, that hauled both freight and passengers between Lead and Deadwood. And then the bottom level was the Deadwood Central, later another subsidiary of the Burlington Railroad, that started out as steam locomotives hauling the passengers and freight. But then they converted it in 1902 to electric trolleys. And that was basically an interurban system of trolley and interurban service for passengers in the Black Hills.
In the 1890s, the railroads found a new source of income: tourism.
The first tourist town was Hot Springs.
People flocked to the town for the medicinal benefits of the naturally warm water.
And of course, Fred Evans catered to them by building the Evans Hotel and it was a really hopping place for a long time, but it had to do with, bringing them in for the hot springs.
Trains brought people to towns, but a lot of tourists wanted to go farther.
They found their way to the resort areas, which eventually became Custer State Park, through stagecoaches that were local in nature. And so these tally-ho stagecoaches, they called them, would haul passengers just like a taxi cab would haul them today.
By 1900, railroads were offering package tours. At the same time, more and better roads were reaching the tourist spots. It was the beginning of the end for Black Hills railroads.
Once more roads went into the higher hills, the freight service started to decline, the passenger service started to decline, and then that just snowballed across the country. So by the 1950s, the passenger train was the rarity.
One by one, rail lines were abandoned. In 1949, the last passenger train to run through the old line through the middle of the hills ran from Deadwood to Edgemont. The freight business held on, barely, until 1983, when the last scheduled train left Deadwood. Only one operating rail line exists in the Black Hills now, the tourist-oriented 1880 train connecting Hill City to Keystone.
The only way you can ride a train is on the 1880 train. And of course that's still steam-powered. And it gives folks a real sense of what traveling by rail was, because from Hill City to Keystone, 10 miles, takes 1 hour. So do the math, it's 10 miles an hour.
It's not that people in the early 1900s could travel much faster by car. A trip through Spearfish Canyon was a slow series of jolts over rocks and dirt. But the independence afforded by the automobile ensured that it was here to stay. For the first 2 decades of the 20th century, roads in rural South Dakota were nothing more than graded dirt. People had to pay tolls to a so-called road boss if they wanted to use whatever road the boss was more or less maintaining. As counties were established, the burden of road building became a county responsibility. Road building between communities was not a coordinated effort. One county's main road didn't necessarily connect to another county's main road. Confronted by a dissatisfied general public and a frustrated business community, Congress and the states made good roads a priority. The Federal Road Aid Act of 1916 authorized the sharing of federal money with the states. That same year, with an amendment to the South Dakota Constitution, the state gave itself the authority to build roads. In 1917, the South Dakota Highway Commission was established. The commission was the forerunner of today's Department of Transportation. The commission promised a statewide system connecting county seats in some towns, but it didn't do much for farmers and others living off the grid. Federal and state monies were building trunk roads, but the county still bore the burden of building farm-to-market roads. Farmers and business owners began to demand not just gravel, but paved roads. Politicians heard the arguments and responded with their own. In the 1930s, Governor William Bulow vowed to limit road building to the amount of available money. He didn't want a debt that future citizens would have to pay. Others pointed out that roads weren't just a cost. They also promoted prosperity. In the Black Hills, that meant tourism. The famed Needles Highway, a road some people said could never be built, was completed in 1921. The Iron Mountain Road, personally laid out by then-Senator Peter Norbeck with the help of designer C.C. Gideon, was completed in 1933. The road offers spectacular views of the surrounding hills, one-lane tunnels in some places framing the faces of Mount Rushmore, and so-called pigtail bridges. Another bridge built in 1929 connected what is now Wind Cave National Park to Custer State Park. The bridge was considered a masterpiece of engineering and concrete construction. It was built by the Northwestern Engineering Company of Rapid City, a company founded just 2 years before by Morris Adelstein. Morris Adelstein's son Stan Adelstein is still in charge of the company. Adelstein is an engineer and longtime South Dakota legislator.
My father's greatest pride was the design of that bridge. I don't know how he did it, but it is. He went on both sides. He started both sides and it curved. It was a very, very interesting construction, and it still carries a very heavy load of traffic.
The younger Adelstein's engineering expertise was applied to America's great highway project of the 1950s and 1960s.
when we started building the interstate, a very interesting nature of economics came to play, because most of our interstate, unlike many other places, are concrete. Well, the reason we used concrete was that the interstate was paid for 80% by the federal government and 20% by the state. Well, if the state owned a cement plant and they specified it should be concrete, the profit from the cement that the state sold to themselves, essentially, to a contractor, paid a good bit of the 20% of the state share.
Most of the money for roads still comes from state and local governments. In terms of total spending, the state and municipal share was $320 billion in 2014. The federal share was $96 billion. That's about 2.4% of overall government spending, a percentage that has remained nearly the same for the past 30 years. Some say it's not enough, that infrastructure across the U.S. is in bad shape, and South Dakota is no exception. These bridges in Pennington County, west of Rapid City, are an example. Wooden structural components approved of at the time are rotting. Wooden retaining walls are bulging in some places. This bridge has a hole in its pavement. Daylight shining through the hole is visible from beneath the bridge. In Pennington County, a wheel tax was proposed. The revenue would have been dedicated to fixing these kinds of problems. The voters rejected it.
So as time has changed, we have become very used to having good roads. And we forget that it takes careful nurturing to keep them in a good condition, and that requires money and planning. And folks just think, well, it's that way today, so it'll be that way tomorrow.
Help might be on the way. Highway bills passed by Congress and the state legislature in 2015 will pump billions of dollars into fixing roads and bridges.
We're in a position where we don't foresee the need to add much additional in the way of new roads. Our focus is going to continue to be maintaining and preserving the condition of what we have while being responsive, to the needs of any future economic development that may occur out there. And our roads are in pretty good shape in the Black Hills, and we want to make sure that we keep them that way going forward.